Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to our continuing series on American history course. Today we're talking about the first part of the New Republic in American history. My name is Paul. I am the social studies instructor here at Penn Foster High School. Some quick information about the program and the members of the educational team. We can be contacted by phone by 1-888-427-1000. You can choose option 5 to talk to myself or the rest of the education team. You can also find some great FAQs as well as how to email us from the help and support page right from your portal. Those emails are usually we're usually able to reply back to them within 24 hours, so pretty quick. We also have live help and webinars like this one available on your program courses page as well. You'll just be able to take a look on the right-hand side and see the high school webinar schedule under other resources. And then finally, we do have both a texting service as well as an appointment scheduler on that webinar schedule as well. So you're always able to contact us with questions, and we so very much encourage you all to do that as you go through the program, anytime you have academic questions or questions about your courses. So the objectives for today, we'll be talking about the new revolutionary thinking that really led to the American Revolution within the colonies. And then we'll be getting into some of the major events of the French and Indian War and some of the impacts of that war as well. So first off, just to be kind of the beginning of the revolutionary thinking that comes within the American colonies. The American Revolution doesn't just happen on a whim. It doesn't happen just at a snap of the fingers of John Adams or Sam Adams or George Washington. It really comes from some of the changing thoughts of not only the American colonies but also in Europe as well. And it really comes to the point of answering the simple question: why was the American Revolution the first success in terms of this revolutionary thinking? And it's really based on the fact that the American colonies, even though we were a colonial power in the British Empire, but there was quite a bit of distance. There was the whole Atlantic Ocean between the American colonies and England. And so that really led to a very indirect rule by the king. The king and the parliament were certainly in control of this colony, but allowed for a fair amount of government rule by the colonies. So each of the colonies had a representative legislature. Thinking back to Virginia, as with their first representative legislature, and the rest of the colonies really followed suit, creating their own legislatures, allowing colonists to serve as part of their government. And a certain amount of self-rule that even though the king and the parliament did have ultimate control, the colonies were able to create their own systems, create their own governments, and create their own laws. And again, the king, the royal family, the monarch, the parliament really kind of had a hands off as long as things were going smoothly. And some more specifics within New England was really the testing ground of democracy, with the town hall meetings, that any major decision that was happening within the colony, within the small towns, they had town halls. People were able to speak, people were able to vote within those cities. The Quakers, predominantly in colonies like Pennsylvania, as a religion, was really based on the idea of equality. Also, the colony of Maryland had been based, if you remember back in your civics course, was based on religious equality and religious freedom. So the idea of equality, the idea of everyone having a chance to live their best lives, live what they wanted to do and do what they wanted to do. And in general, not a whole lot of loyalty to the British, that many many of the colonists, even from the very beginning, were not of the British descent, were not British citizens. They were coming from other countries as well. So we see sort of this movement of migration into the American colonies, even way back when we weren't even a country yet. So not a lot of ties to Britain, predominantly throughout the American colonies. So this sort of allowed it to be ripe for not only a revolution, but to gain independence, but also a revolution of thought. And one of the big ways that there was a revolutionary thought was the Age of Enlightenment and the Age of Reason, that not only was within the American colonies, but throughout Europe as well. And it was sparked by sort of a loss of institutional religious faith, that many of the denominations of Christianity that had been warring with each other for centuries began to see that there were similarities between predominantly the Protestant religions and then Catholicism, that because of those similarities, they were willing to talk to each other. They were able to work with each other in society. There was also a greater place for science within religion. You know, the idea that the Big Bang theory as well as creationism were not we're not ones we're not different. We're not ones that could only live by themselves. There were some scholars within Christianity, some scholars within the Enlightenment and science who tried to marry the two, tried to combine the two. So we really kind of see a blossoming, a growth of new thought process throughout this Enlightenment period that started again in Europe, but then cross over the Atlantic. And in particular, there was sort of a rise of new age religions at the time. So Unitarianism, which was based on far more freedom, far more belief in one another, and more about utility between people, rose in New England and allowed for more people to, again, feel sort of a closeness, feel a greater connection with each other, not just based on the divisions of religion. We also see changes in political philosophers. For centuries, there was the belief of most political philosophers that kings and absolute rulers was the only way that societies could govern. That because people were genuinely evil and were people that people were I'm sorry, that people were jealous of each other, were mean to each other, that it was only based on that only a strong monarchy could really control government and control society, that was the only kind of government that was allowed, or that would be created. Within Enlightenment, we see a new revolution of political thought that really kind of put aside the idea that absolute monarchies was the only way, and brought up new ideas. John Locke was one of the more famous political philosophers of the Enlightenment, who believed in equality and talked about that all men are created equal and have unalienable rights, something that we obviously know also from the Declaration of Independence. Thomas Jefferson was a big believer and a big reader of John Locke's political philosophies. Philosophers also like Jean-Jacques Rousseau talked of the will of the people, that the people should have the ability to govern themselves, that a government could only work properly if it had the consent of the governed through elections or through popular vote. And then another political philosopher, Baron von Maskus, talked about the dangers of concentrated power, that the old saying that absolute power corrupts absolutely. Even though the absolute monarchs of the time, for a long time, were concentrated on power, concentrated on creating their own, prospering of the entire country because of wars, because of taxations. As we get into the Enlightenment period, the absolute monarchs start kind of fraying, in part because they become corrupt themselves. That after generation and generation of absolute power, the new rulers, and we'll talk about one of them in France in a few minutes, later in the presentation, I should say, they become far more corrupt. They become far more interested in lining their own pockets, creating their own wealth, that they stop caring about the rest of the people in their countries. And the Baron also talked about the branches of government, that not only should there be a consent of the governed, like Rousseau, but that different parts of government should be ruling different authorities, and that comes into play with our Congress and even Parliament in England. That because we have in the United States today, we have a president, we have a Congress, we have a federal court system. Each of them should be equal. Each of them are supposed to be equal, and each of them are supposed to have specific powers that are supposed to keep the other ones from gaining too much power. That was and our founders got that information, or got that idea, from these Enlightenment philosophers. And that leads us to our first poll question. Who wrote that power should be concentrated or should not be concentrated within or by just a single person? And that, of course, should have been Montesquieu, Baron Montesquieu, Baron de Montesquieu, sorry, in as one of the famous Enlightenment philosophers. Another great movement within the American colonies was the Enlightenment, or I'm sorry, the Great Awakening. And this really brought out new fervor, new religious fervor within the colonies. This is one of the unique components of American politics and American religion, that the Great Awakening comes out not by sort of the traditional priests or traditional religious leaders, but it comes from those who want to provide their own. One second, I'm sorry. Okay, sorry about that. That new religious leaders wanted to create a new not necessarily a new religion, but they wanted to create a new system that allowed people around the colonies to profess their faith. So new evangelists, essentially, new Jonathan Edwards, George Whitefield, those who are not necessarily ministers, not necessarily trained ministers, but people who wanted to reject the ideas of the Enlightenment, reject the ideas of it's okay for everyone to think certain ways, but they wanted to create a new revolution, a new religious revolution, one that had new kinds of ministers, those who, again, were not necessarily classically trained, not necessarily trained in the Bible, but those who could really excite the masses, excite the people, and help them understand the ideas of religion, the ideas of Christianity. The Great Awakening also spoke about equality, that Christianity as a religion was really focused on equality and focus on those who are less fortunate, really pushing the ideas from the stories of the gospel, the stories of Jesus. And then generally a shared experience, that it was not necessarily about those at the pulpit who were going to be speaking down, but about everyone kind of talking to each other in these Great Awakening meetings, everyone got the chance to talk. Everyone got a chance to be able to speak about what they believed and what they wanted to see within their religion. Another big component, another big philosophy that came to America was the idea of a free press. And this really comes out with the trial of John Peter Ziegler, who was the editor and printer of the New York Weekly Journal. And he was put on trial for what's called libel, and libel particularly against the government and that of the royal governor William Cosby. And Ziegler believed that Cosby was corrupt and generally stupid, that he was accusing Cosby of helping the French take more and more power and more area in the New York harbor. That even at this point there was a lot of conflict between the French and the British. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in a couple minutes. But Ziegler was really believed that Cosby was in fact supporting the French against the British. So he was accusing Cosby in his New York Weekly Journal, and Cosby had Ziegler arrested. Now, originally, when Ziegler was arrested, the trial was only those who were royal supporters and supporters of Cosby. However, because of the free press that was already in New York, and the Weekly Journal was continuing to be supported and being published by Zinger's wife, that caused a public outcry, and believing that the trial could not be corrupt, could not simply be allow Cosby to get his way or punish Zinger for publishing information. So the judge was forced to allow for a new jury, and it becomes truly a jury of Zinger's peers. So those who were normal colonists were now put onto the jury, as opposed to the supporters of Cosby, who were not necessarily in the colony or lived in the colony. And the Zinger's attorney really did a brilliant job. Andrew Hamilton essentially told the jury, told the court, told the accusers that it was not Zinger's job and not Hamilton's job to call themselves innocent of the charges of libel, to say that they are just speaking against the government. But his point was that in order for libel to be found guilty, or for Zinger to be found guilty of libel, I should say, the prosecution had to first prove that the articles were false, which was not the typical libel case for the government. Typically, the government had a libel case and was able to accuse someone of libel if they were simply writing something that was not nice about the government. Hamilton pushed the idea that the prosecutors actually had to prove that the articles were false in order to be charged with libel. Well, as the case ends, the judge tries to order Zinger guilty because he is still a supporter of Cosby, but the jury themselves actually find him not guilty, and that was where the power laid within the courts in the colony, that the jury found him not guilty, and thus began the sort of belief in the American colonies that the press ought to be free to be able to write what they want, that they could still be accused of libel if articles are found to be not true, or if they're found to be misleading, which is still the facts today. But they cannot be accused of libel if they're simply not being nice to the government. They have to be proven to be false. Another big revolutionary thinking among the American colonies, and this is sort of a funny part of a revolutionary thinking, is that the American colonists were very big on smuggling within their colonies and kind of breaking the laws by Britain. one of the reasons and one of the ways that the British tried to make money off their colonies was what's called mercantilism, which meant that essentially the colonies and the idea is that the colonies enrich Britain by buying goods made by other British colonies and then sending out their goods to Britain or to other colonies as well. So the money continuously just flows into the British government, and Parliament tries passing laws for all the entire empire to continue to ensure that the money was going to the British, that no money that was being paid or being sold was not within the British Empire. Well, the American colonists decided they didn't like that. And while they were breaking that law, the British government was not really able to or not willing to do much with it. Really, something called salutary neglect, in that the government wasn't necessarily changing the law, but they weren't willing to enforce it. So as the colonists were smuggling goods from either the French in Canada or from Spain in Latin America or Mexico and South America or other countries, or also trying to smuggle their own goods out to these countries, the British weren't really willing or able to do a whole lot about this. And anytime they did try to arrest smugglers, and these were people who were generally more wealthier colonists, thinking of notably men like John Hancock was a very known smuggler. But anytime they were arrested, the juries, who were again juries of the smugglers' peers, typically found them guilty, or I'm sorry, found them not guilty. We also see a sort of a ramping up of different rebellions throughout the years before the American Revolution, and so we see particularly those that are against British rule, not necessarily directly after the rule. They weren't looking for any kind of ways of independence, but they were trying to change minds. They were the Bacon's Rebellion, the Regulators, the New York Tenants, the Paxton Boys, all attempts at kind of changing the government and changing the rules within each of the colonies. And so this is really beginning to allow Americans to distinguish themselves from Britain, from the rest of the colonies, and really from the rest of the world. That in all these cases of the free press, of the Great Awakening, of the really the smuggling and the rejection of mercantilism, these are all rejections of the current order, the current world order that the British had been successful in, that the Spanish had been successful in previously, that France is successful in. So in all these cases, America is beginning to distinguish itself as saying, you know what, I don't really like this rule. I don't like this policy. I don't like this idea. So they're continuously trying to kind of push the envelope of what is acceptable within society. And now we see sort of the next kind of the fraying of relations between the British and the American colonies. And it comes when an old war comes to the New World. And it's set up with the division of most of North America between the French and the Americans and the British. New France, as it was called, was considered most of the middle of Canada and the United States. And France was sort of unique between the British, the Spanish, and the French, as attempting to have very good alliances with Native American tribes throughout this region, and in particular also trying to convert them. So we see a lot of conversions to Catholicism from the French. And we also see a very more direct rule from the King of France in the form of magistrates who were ruling the New France territories. And we begin to also see that the British and tensions between the Britain and France begin growing, particularly in beginning with the 1600s, as France is sort of the kind of rising power or is the dominant power within Europe and within the rest of the world. And we kind of begin to see the decline, though, with the royal rule of King Louis XIV. You'll remember kind of back at the beginning with the Enlightenment philosophers and the idea of absolute power corrupting absolutely. Louis XIV and his next couple of successors really kind of embody the idea of corruption with absolute power. That Louis XIV, who wanted to be known as the sun god, really took more and more of the money out of France into his own pocket, and creating massive statues of himself, massive and also massive built structures for him and houses for him. Famously, the Versailles Palace in Paris is what was built by him and funded by taxpayers of France. But as he does this, and as he continues to try to have wars to expand his territory, the debt for the country rises and rises. And on the other side, we see more and more of their territory being lost because Britain is rising because of those wars. But Britain does not want to see the same things happen to them. So as they're able to win smaller, more and more, small and now more significant wars with France, Britain finds themselves almost sort of in the same situation, only slightly in reverse. That their debt is rising, their costs are rising, but it's mostly because their territories are growing. So they sort of begin to. We almost see a learning of the lessons from France that leads us to the American Revolution eventually. But we'll see that in a little while. But as I mentioned, that the sort of the growth of the wars and the fighting between the French and the British leads us to the famous 100 Years' War between France and England, which really becomes a world war because all the different territorial areas of the French and the British are really at war with each other. And the sort of the American equivalent of that is called the French and Indian War, in which the French and their Indian allies fight the British and their British allies, or I'm sorry, and their Indian allies, I should say. The first phase of this war is really a disaster for the British. They try to attack the small settlements of the French around New France, and it becomes just a total disaster. The French are not only able to defeat and confuse them, but they actually end up almost defeating the British fairly quickly, almost get to Philadelphia, and this really puts the British into a panic, that they realize that this plan is not working for them, and that they need a new strategy. So they bring in William Pitt as the new leader of the British military. He knows that in order to win, the British need to be just dominating the battlefield. That cannot be just small skirmishes. It has to be an all-out war. So he turns to sort of younger commanders, many of them American colonists, to try to come up with a more unconventional battle plan to fight the British, or I'm sorry, to fight the French. And this is generally a very successful strategy, and it gets them all the way to St. Lawrence River, which is just north of New York and north of Pennsylvania, and that is where really the Pitt and the British forces are really able to force the surrender of the French. Because of the powerful waterway of the St. Lawrence into the Great Lakes, and the French are finally defeated permanently in the French and Indian War, sort of in the American colonies, at Montreal in what is now Canada. The Treaty of Paris really just devastates and eliminates the French territories in America, and the and it allows for the colonists and the British to feel much closer. Unfortunately, it is only temporary, and it's temporary because colonists begin to not just believe in their closeness with the British, but even more so, they feel a much more closeness to each other. That they begin to have the sort of the philosophy or the idea of being Americans. That Americans were able to win this war. It wasn't the British. It wasn't British soldiers coming over from Britain to defeat the French. It was American colonists fighting the French and winning. And that is our second poll question also. Why did the colonists feel close to the British? Well, generally, it's the fact that they felt more unified um, with each other more so than the British. That Americans defeated the French, not just the British. Our final topic this afternoon will be about George Washington. George Washington, are the father of our country, the father of the first in our hearts and our minds as Americans. We sort of have a myth of Washington nowadays as being honest, that he couldn't tell a lie about cutting down the cherry tree, that he had massive strength, being able to his throws across the river, and then just a general humility that even though he could have been essentially king of America and be president for life, he chose not to do that. He wanted to retire. He wanted to leave American government, American presidency. And even before then, he wanted to leave as general. He was ready to retire to Virginia. He was kind of pulled back into service as American president, and did that so reluctantly as well. But as the man, as sort of what we know of him early on, he was a surveyor for Virginia as a youth, surveyor, and then eventually a farmer. But as a surveyor, Washington learned a lot about the colony of Virginia and learned a lot about the land of Virginia that helped him later on as a military commander, and also for the British, but then also for the American colonies as well. His first major position within the British Empire during the French and Indian War was that of a messenger, and he tried sending a message to Fort de Queens, which was basically sending a message to have them surrender. The French obviously rejected, don't even let Washington deliver his message. And Washington is actually successful when he returns to the fort, defeating the French there and calling and renaming it Fort Pitt. So Washington has sort of initial disasters, but then is able to have more success as still as one of the young commanders of William Pitt, able to have success with this new British within the British forces. So that is the end of our webinar. I do appreciate your attendance and your listening. If you do have questions, please make sure that you use the resources that were at the beginning of the webinar. Let me show them one more time before we end today. But I do greatly, again, appreciate everything, and good luck in your studies.